Clapperboard story, the first 100 days that never were. They told me I couldn't. They told me America wasn't ready. But on that cold January morning, as I placed my hand on the Bible, the same one my mother carried when she first stepped onto American soil, I became the first woman, the first black woman, the first woman of South Asian descent to lead the free world. The weight of 246 years of history pressed against my chest like a physical force. And I had exactly 100 days to prove that this wasn't just a historic moment, it was a turning point. Day 1, the Oval Office felt smaller than I imagined. The morning light filtered through those famous windows, and I could still hear the echoes of the inaugural crowd chanting outside. But there was no time for sentiment. On my desk sat 3 folders, each one marked urgent in red letters that seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat. Folder 1, Economic Crisis, Inflation at 6.2%. Folder 2, Climate Emergency, Record Wildfires, Unprecedented Flooding. Folder 3, Immigration System Collapse, 2.3 million cases backlogged. I opened the first folder, and that's when I saw the number that would haunt my first week: 78%. That's how many Americans, according to the latest poll, believed the country was heading in the wrong direction. Madam President, my Chief of Staff interrupted, her voice tight with urgency. The Senate Minority Leader is already calling for obstruction. They're saying. I know what they're saying, I cut her off, my fingers drumming against the mahogany desk that had witnessed so many pivotal moments. They said it during the campaign. They'll say it tomorrow. But here's what they don't understand. I paused, looking at the portrait of Eleanor Roosevelt on the wall, the woman who redefined what a first lady could be when everyone told her to sit down and be quiet. We're not asking for permission anymore. Day 7, the first executive order and the first firestorm. The pen felt heavier than it should have. Maybe because I knew that my signature on this document would trigger an avalanche, one that would either reshape American healthcare or bury my presidency before it truly began. Executive Order 14001, Emergency Prescription Drug Price Caps. Insulin, 35 maximum per month. Life-saving medications, capped at 200% of manufacturing cost. Medicare negotiation powers, immediate implementation. The pharmaceutical lobby's response was swift and vicious. By noon, their lawyers had filed 17 lawsuits. By evening, the attack ads were already running. President Harris wants to destroy American innovation. But I couldn't stop thinking about the letter I'd received during the campaign from Maria, a 67-year-old grandmother in Ohio who had been rationing her insulin, choosing between medication and groceries. She died 3 weeks before the election. Would you have signed it knowing the political cost I did? And that night, I didn't sleep, not because I regretted it but because I knew this was just the beginning of a war I had to win. Day 15, the phone call that changed everything. It came at 3:47 a.m. The shrill ring of the secure line cut through the darkness of the presidential bedroom like a scream. Madam President, we have a situation. Those 6 words. Every president dreads them. My heart hammered against my ribs as I listened to the National Security Advisor's briefing. Category 5 hurricane forming in the Gulf. Projected path, directly toward Houston. 48 hours until landfall. Climate scientists are calling it unprecedented. But here's what the briefing didn't say, what I discovered when I demanded the raw data. Houston's flood infrastructure, designed for 1970s climate patterns. Storm surge projections, 15 to 20 feet. Evacuation capacity, insufficient for 2.3 million residents. Federal Disaster Fund, already depleted from the previous year's wildfires. How long do we have to decide, I asked, my voice steady even as my mind raced through scenarios, each one more catastrophic than the last. 6 hours, ma'am. After that, it might be too late to evacuate. 6 hours to decide whether to order the largest peacetime evacuation in American history. Day 16, the storm and the decision. The images were apocalyptic. Satellite feeds showed the hurricane we'd named it Artemis swirling like a massive predator, its eye fixed on the Texas coast with terrifying precision. In the Situation Room, faces glowed blue in the monitor light. The governor of Texas sat across from me via secure video, his jaw tight. "Madam President, if you federalize this evacuation and you're wrong if the storm shifts, this will define your presidency. And if I don't act and people die," I shot back, feeling the heat rise in my chest. "How will that define it? Here's what nobody tells you about being president: every decision is a door, and you never know what's behind it until you turn the handle." I gave the order at 4:23 a.m. Executive action, Federal Emergency Declaration. Mandatory evacuation. U.S. military support. FEMA full deployment. The criticism was immediate and brutal: overreach. Federal tyranny. She's weaponizing climate change for political points. But you know what? When Artemis made landfall 41 hours later with winds exceeding 180 miles per hour, when the storm surge hit exactly where the models predicted, when the death toll was 47 instead of the projected 2,000, plus those critics went silent. Almost silent. Day 28, the courtroom gambit. Madam President, the Supreme Court has agreed to hear the emergency petition. I knew it was coming. The pharmaceutical companies had fast-tracked their lawsuit, arguing that my executive order on drug prices violated about a dozen constitutional provisions. But I had a plan. One that no one saw coming. I invited the Chief Justice to the White House. Not for a discussion about the case that would be inappropriate, possibly illegal, no, I invited him to meet someone. Her name was Sophie. She was 8 years old. Type 1 diabetic. And before my executive order, her family had been spending $1,200 a month on insulin, more than their rent. "Mr. Chief Justice," I said as Sophie sat between us, her small hands folded in her lap, "I'm not asking you to rule in my favor. I'm asking you to remember why we have a constitution in the first place. To protect life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Sophie here, she deserves all three. Was it manipulative? Maybe. Was it necessary? Absolutely." Day 45, the immigration dilemma. The protests outside the White House had grown. Thousands of people, split down the middle, one side chanting, "Open the borders. Humanity over politics." The other roaring, "Secure our nation. Law and order." And me, I was trapped in the middle, trying to find a solution that would satisfy no one but might actually work. Here's what I proposed on day 45, the New American Pathway Act Executive Framework. 1. Immediate processing of 500,000 backlogged asylum cases. 2. Technology-enhanced border security, not a wall, sensors, drones, AI surveillance. 3. Work permits issued within 30 days for asylum applicants. 4. Fast-track citizenship for dreamers, no more waiting. 5. Partnership with Mexico and Central American nations, address root causes of migration with $10 billion aid package. The response: the left called me a sellout for enhancing border security. The right called me reckless for the asylum processing. Nobody was happy. Which meant I might actually be doing something right. But late that night, alone in the treaty room, I wondered, was I solving the problem, or just delaying the inevitable collision? Day 60, the Climate Summit Showdown. The Emergency Climate Summit in Washington brought together world leaders, but the real tension wasn't in the Grand Hall, it was in the backroom negotiations. China's delegation sat across from me, their lead negotiator's expression unreadable. "Madam President, you ask us to cut emissions by 50% while your own country has spent a century polluting without restraint. Where is the justice in that? He had a point. A valid one that made my carefully prepared talking points feel hollow. So I did something unscripted. Something my advisors later called diplomatic suicide. I agreed with him. You're right, I said, watching his eyes widen in surprise. America bears historical responsibility. So here's what I'm proposing: the United States will fund 70% of the global renewable energy transition for developing nations. $500 billion over 10 years. But in exchange, every nation commits to carbon neutrality by 2045. The room went silent. My own delegation looked like I'd just declared war on the economy. Madam President, my climate envoy whispered urgently, Congress will never approve that funding. Then I'll fight them, I whispered back. Because the alternative is watching the world burn. Would you have made that promise knowing you might not be able to keep it? Day 75, the betrayal. It came from someone I trusted. Someone I'd brought into my inner circle because we'd fought together for years in the Senate. The leak hit the Washington Post at 6 p.m. Harris administration knew about drug price loopholes, did nothing. The story claimed that pharmaceutical companies had found legal workarounds to my executive order, and that my team had discovered them weeks ago but kept quiet to avoid bad press. It wasn't true. Well, not entirely. We'd discovered the loopholes, yes, but we'd been working frantically to close them through regulatory action. But perception is reality in politics. My approval rating dropped 7 points overnight. I called an emergency meeting. Who leaked this? The faces around the table were a mixture of anger and fear. But one person wouldn't meet my eyes. It was Marcus, my deputy chief of staff. The man who'd been with me since my attorney general days. Why, I asked him later, after everyone had left, my voice breaking despite my efforts to stay composed. Because you're moving too fast, he said, not quite able to look at me. You're trying to change everything at once, and it's going to destroy us. I thought if I slowed you down. Get out, I said quietly. Then louder, get out. That night, I cried for the first time since Inauguration Day. Not because of the betrayal, though that hurt like a physical wound. But because I realized something terrifying: even the people who believed in me were afraid of what I was trying to do. Day 90, the impossible choice. Madam President, the bill is on your desk. The American Recovery and Investment Act, 2,000 pages of compromise, negotiation, and political horse trading. It included $300 billion for infrastructure, $150 billion for clean energy, universal pre-K funding, expanded healthcare subsidies. Everything I'd fought for. Everything I'd promised. But buried on page 1847 was a provision that made my stomach turn: mandatory minimum sentences for certain immigration violations, a direct contradiction of my justice reform principles. The Senate leadership had been clear: it's this or nothing, Madam President. We don't have the votes otherwise. I sat in the Oval Office, the signing pen in my hand, staring at my mother's portrait on the wall. She'd been a civil rights activist, a woman who never compromised her principles. What would she do? I called my vice president, my attorney general, my closest advisors. I got 5 different opinions. Then I called someone else, someone whose number I probably shouldn't have had, but did. A formerly incarcerated woman named Jennifer, who'd served 15 years for a nonviolent drug offense. Someone who'd been a victim of the exact kind of harsh sentencing laws embedded in this bill. Jen, I said, my voice shaking, I need your advice. And I need you to be brutally honest. What she told me changed everything. Day 100, the reckoning. The press conference was scheduled for 2 p.m. Every major network was carrying it live. The entire world wanted to know, would President Harris sign the bill? I walked to the podium, feeling every eye in the room on me. The clicking of camera shutters sounded like distant gunfire. 100 days ago, I began. I stood on the Capitol steps and made a promise to the American people. I promised transformation. I promised justice. I promised change. I paused, letting the tension build. Today, I'm here to tell you that change is messy. It's imperfect. It requires compromise that cuts against your soul and decisions that keep you awake at night. I pulled out the bill. This legislation represents thousands of hours of negotiation. It will help millions of Americans. It will invest in our future, in our children, in our planet. Another pause. The room was so silent I could hear my own heartbeat. But it also contains provisions that violate everything I stand for. Provisions that would hurt the most vulnerable among us. I saw the journalists lean forward, pens ready. So I've made a decision. I'm signing this bill because the good it will do is profound and immediate. But I'm simultaneously issuing an executive order directing the Attorney General to apply prosecutorial discretion to those immigration provisions, effectively nullifying their harshest elements. And I'm announcing that on day 101, I will personally introduce legislation to remove those provisions entirely. The room erupted. Chaos. Madam President. Isn't that unconstitutional? Are you defying Congress? Isn't this executive overreach? I raised my hand for silence. No president is perfect. No administration gets everything right. But what I can promise you, what I do promise you, is that I will fight for justice every single day I'm in this office. Even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Because that's what leaders do. We make the impossible possible. Epilogue, Day 101. I woke up to headlines that ranged from glowing to scathing. Harris defies convention. Constitutional crisis or courageous leadership. The most controversial first 100 days in modern history. My approval rating had dropped to 43%. But you know what else happened? Insulin prices had fallen by 65% for millions of Americans. The climate summit had secured commitments from 147 nations. 200,000 asylum cases had been processed. Sophie, that 8-year-old girl, sent me a crayon drawing that now hangs in my private study. Did I make mistakes? Absolutely. Did I compromise my values? Sometimes. But did I change the trajectory of this nation? Did I prove that a woman, a black woman, a daughter of immigrants, could lead the most powerful country on earth every single day? As I sat down at the resolute desk on day 101, I picked up my pen and thought about the next 100 days. The next 1,000 days. Because this wasn't just about making history, this was about making the future. And I was just getting started.